I received a reader request to do a video on Richard Nixon, and I was waiting for the right moment to do one, but I came across a book today which had some interesting thoughts on Nixon, so I wanted to share those with you and also offer some commentary. And I want to focus in particular on the on Nixon's legacy, his pardoning, and try to draw some lessons for Trump as we approach the release of the Mueller report. So the book I came across today, you can see it here. It's here it is, by James Rosen. The title is Cheney One-on-One, A Candid Conversation with America's Most Controversial Statesman. And basically Rosen just interviews him about a wide variety of topics. And he has a couple of pages here about, he talks to Cheney about Nixon. Cheney was a young aide in the Nixon White House, and it doesn't seem like he really got to know Nixon personally, but that period in time at the administration was formative for him. So Rosen here, he prompts Cheney, and he says, I think people forget about Nixon that there are only two Americans in our history who have run on a national ticket 5 times. One is Franklin Roosevelt, one is Richard Nixon. So Nixon ran five times, the last one being in 1972, when he won a landslide victory, losing only one state. And so that was like around the time that Cheney was in the Nixon administration. And then Rosen here, he prompts Cheney again. He says, when John Kenneth Galbraith was asked once in the aftermath of Watergate, don't you think there is a little Nixon in all of us? He said, the hell there is. But it seems to me that if you're running on a national ticket 5 times, that speaks to some core affinity with the American people. Does Nixon, in your view, deserve to be ranked at or near the bottom of the presidents, where historians tend to place him? So I wanted to talk about that point first, about there being a little Nixon in all of us. So, I think Galbraith, I think that question, Galbraith's response was about some of the darker sides of Richard Nixon, which obviously were exposed in Watergate. But I think it's important here to reflect on why Nixon managed to become such a prominent figure in American politics in the first place. And I think he, although the dark side came later, I think the reality is that Nixon also embodied much of what was redeeming about America, what was and what the country needed. And I think there were really 2 aspects of his early or pre-presidential biography that are notable and that account for why he was able to ultimately catapult himself to the presidency. So one was his personal biography, and Nixon was really a self-made man. He grew up in I would say a middle class family in California. They certainly weren't wealthy, and Nixon basically just made his way. He went to Whitaker College. He was on the football team, then made his way to Duke Law School, and really just rose up the ranks. And the grit and the determination and so forth were a big part of Nixon's appeal. And it was a populist appeal, to be sure, but not populist necessarily in the cheap kind of way that we see now, but more populist in the sense of being a genuine self-made man. And then the second one was his political philosophy, and much of his political tenure was really defined by his anti-communism. As a young congressman, Nixon took the lead in investigating Alger Hiss. He was a sort of prominent diplomat, someone who really embodied the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, when Hiss was accused of being a communist spy, a Soviet spy. Much of the establishment was inclined to believe him, but Nixon really dug in, investigated him, and basically exposed him for, in fact, being a Soviet spy at the highest levels of the government. And Nixon was ultimately vindicated when the Venona Project came out after the Cold War, which released cables, basically proving definitively that Hiss was a spy. Nixon's Senate campaign also was against Helen Douglas, who he labeled as being the Pink Lady, basically alluding to the fact that she wasn't exactly a hardened anti-communist. So Nixon really adopted this and really made a part of his brand and identity being a tough anti-communist, and he did so at a time when I think it's fair to say that although the McCarthy era did see some anti-communist excess, that there was a real problem on the American left with people on the American left, both at the elite level and also at the grassroots level, really resonating or sympathizing with global communism and with the Soviet Union, and were slow to really recognize the threat of both of communist ideology, but also the Soviet Union. So I think that's what, so when Nixon was on he as a candidate for Senate, when he was ultimately chosen by Eisenhower to be his running mate, Nixon always appealed to Americans in some way due to a combination of his grit, his background, but also his tough anti-communism. Okay, so then Rosen here, he asked Cheney, okay, does Nixon, in your view, deserve to be ranked at or near the bottom of the presidents where historians tend to place him? And Cheney kind of ducks the question a little bit. So then Rosen comes back at him and he says, well, was Nixon a good president? So now Cheney answers. He says, I think he was in some respects. I think he gets a lot of credit and deserves it for what he did in the international arena, especially with respect to Moscow and to Beijing. And I think those were that he managed, that was his first love, but that he managed the foreign policy situation in terms of China and Russia with considerable skill and success, having Henry Kissinger for his Secretary of State. Okay, so basically now Cheney here is commenting on Nixon's foreign policy achievements. And I think here it's important to note, it's quite remarkable, in my view, that as divisive and controversial of a figure as Nixon was, he, even his 1968 election was quite close. I mean, I think many historians believe, and I'm inclined to agree, that had Nixon, or had there been another Republican candidate, the 68 election might have gone more decisively for the Republicans, but it was actually a close victory. But from 68 to 72, Nixon really presided and was a president who was unifying in a way that not too many people would have anticipated. Part of it was his foreign policy achievements, which Cheney notes here, sort of putting relations with the Soviet Union on a more sustainable footing, opening China, and generally kind of allowing the U.S. to regain its foothold with many of the defeats and setbacks it was suffering in Vietnam. But equally important, I think, was Nixon's role in domestic policy, where he, to the chagrin of many conservatives and libertarians, he made peace with the New Deal and with certain elements of the Great Society. He launched many initiatives that would prove to be prophetic, like the war on cancer. And he also found a middle way of sorts on racial issues and desegregation issues. And he didn't go as far or as fast, I think, as what many people at the time wanted, but he did provide leadership that could broadly unify the country and begin to move toward more and more desegregation. So by the time the 72 election came around, he won, to a lot of people's surprise, a landslide election. Okay, so then obviously his second term becomes consumed with Watergate. And here Cheney talks here, and he praises Nixon for how he handled Watergate in some sense. And he says, he says, everybody says you can never forget Watergate. Well, fair enough. But he also, in the end, stepped down and resigned. And then Rosen says, yeah, in addition to resigning, he also surrendered the tapes. And then Cheney adds, in addition to surrendering the tapes, he ultimately, rather than going through the full trial in the Senate, he basically spared the country the trial and the turmoil that would have resulted if he went through a full trial, and he resigned. Now after Nixon resigned, obviously he was leaving the presidency on a sour footing. He was facing any number of post-presidency legal challenges, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, ended up making at the time, very controversial decision to pardon Nixon. And this was actually a very dramatic move, because when Gerald Ford had taken over as president, he was quite popular, and he was seen as a competent president, a unifier. He was relatively unknown, but he quickly earned the respect of the American people. But when Ford pardoned Nixon, all of a sudden now there was an uproar where people suspected maybe there was a corrupt bargain here. Maybe they had decided this beforehand. They thought that maybe Nixon was getting away with a crime that he didn't deserve. And a lot of historians believe, and I think they're probably right, that given how close the 76 election was, the decision to pardon Nixon may very well have cost Ford his re-election and led to the Jimmy Carter years. But this decision to pardon Nixon, which was quite controversial at the time, overall has met the approval of most historians, most people who follow American politics. Ted Kennedy, most famously, just absolutely lambasted Ford at the time. Also made it a feature of his subsequent campaigns. But then later on, Ted Kennedy recanted, and he said, I was wrong, that the pardoning of Nixon was justified. And the reason people think it was justified in part was because it helped preserve the sort of stature and decency of the presidency. It also sort of prevented a nasty post-partisan fight that may have ripped the country apart. But I think also a big part of why this decision came to be seen in a favorable light is how Richard Nixon himself conducted himself. So he took the honorable approach of, first of all, resigning when he very well could have dragged out the process, and in doing so, I think he set an example for future presidents. But then also the way Nixon conducted himself in the post-presidential period. He made a comeback. He wrote a bunch of books. He became an elder statesman. He had a network of foreign counterparts who respected him and paid heed to him. He was an advisor to every president that came afterwards. And you really see this if you go back and watch the Nixon's funeral. It's available on C-SPAN, and the eulogies are quite remarkable, where they talk a great deal about his policy legacy, and the only person who really made much mention of Watergate was then President Clinton, and he made like a somewhat passing allusion to Watergate, but it was almost like Watergate was forgotten when you looked at the totality of his a legacy and career, and Clinton himself talks about how Nixon would come by and give him advice on how to handle Russia. Now another part of his legacy, in addition to how Nixon conducted himself, was the how Nixon alumni, how younger aides and staffers and officials from the Nixon years ended up also having productive careers. So here, Cheney's now talking. Let's see. So he said that in the immediate aftermath of the Nixon years, those who had worked for Nixon had a mentality of, geez, here are a few survivors here. Keep your head down. We don't really want anybody to know we're meeting. And then Cheney says, but over time, those who had served in the Nixon administration, they began to view it as a more positive thing. there is a broader sense of perspective in terms of that period of time. So over time, I mean, basically, if you look at many of the people who ended up playing prominent roles in American politics later on, many of them got their start in the Nixon years. So people like George Shultz, who became the Secretary of State under Reagan, oversaw the tail end of the Cold War. Alan Greenspan as Fed chair. I mean, there was a whole roster of these people who came of age in the Nixon years and ended up really through the not only the Reagan years, but really into the 90s, ended up playing a positive role in American politics. Now, I think this, as we reflect now on Nixon's legacy, I think this is going to become more and more of a discussion as we enter the last few years of Donald Trump's first term, where I think when the Mueller report drops, given where the Democratic Party is, given the fact that they control the Congress, and just given where Trump's approval ratings are, I think unless the Mueller report surprises everyone and really comes up with nothing, which I think is hard to believe in light of how many indictments there have already been from the investigation, I think we're very quickly going to enter a period where the House, at least Democrats in the House, move to impeach him. I think they'll probably have the votes to do so, if only on a straight partisan line. And at that point, both there are going to be a number of decisions. So one will obviously be on Trump himself, and the question will be, will he fight it out? Will he try to survive the way Bill Clinton did, or will he sort of take his appeals to the court? Will he withstand a trial in the Senate? Will he put the country through that? Another thing he'll have to think about is whether or not to resign. And here, even if he doesn't want to resign, one of the things that will be weighing on him is what it might mean for his post-presidency. So, if he decides to resign, I think that would make it easier, especially in light of the Nixon precedent for Pence to pardon him. But the question now becomes is, if whether or not Trump ends up leaving office prematurely. In his post-presidency, my guess, I could be wrong here, but my guess is probably that Trump's legal battles are not going to end. And even if Trump ends up deciding to carry out with his first term, even if either he ends up not running for re-election or he ends up getting voted out, there will be this question for Trump's successor, whoever it is, on whether or not to grant Trump a pardon. And so the question basically that the country is going to have to litigate in some way is whether or not the Nixon precedent, the Nixon pardon that ought to apply to Trump. Now, I've sort of, as if you watch this video, I mean, I've basically made the argument that the Nixon pardon for Watergate was justified. And I think one was given Nixon's service prior to the presidency, the fact that he, one, was an inspiration with his own personal background and biography, and two, because he took up the cause of anti-communism and was vindicated for it. Number two, because of his presidency, which by and large was a reasonably productive, unifying presidency, one kind of leadership that Watergate notwithstanding, the country broadly needed. And then third, the aftermath, where both Nixon emerged as an elder statesman and also where people who served in his presidency ended up broadly providing good leadership for the country. Now, I think if you apply these three criteria, I think the argument for pardoning Trump may be weaker. I mean, I think, Trump, if you look at Trump's pre-presidential period, I mean, I don't know that one can say that he was necessarily a positive force or an inspiration for Americans. I mean, maybe not. I think he wrote some good self-help books. I think he inspired people to some degree to pursue business success. He obviously built a personal brand and a TV brand that appealed to people. But I think it would be a stretch to say that Trump really devoted himself to public service in the way Nixon did. In terms of the achievements of his presidency, again, I mean, he certainly has not set himself up for a decisive win. He certainly hasn't unified the country the way Nixon did. I think with perhaps the exception of tax reform, there haven't been all that many policy victories coming from this administration. So a pardon in terms of offering gratitude for the achievements of the Trump presidency will be a much harder case for Nixon to make, or for Bill Clinton to make, for that matter. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Clinton got away from with not resigning after the Starr report was, at least in part, because much of the country believed that he was basically a competent commander-in-chief, a competent president, and they were able to separate his personal foibles from his personal scandal. And so then this leaves the third issue of whether or not a pardon of Trump would be broadly good for the presidency. And here, I think, in my mind, it's an open question. I think it'll come down largely to how Trump conducts himself after the Mueller report is out, after the country sort of renders its verdict on whether the charges are serious enough and damaging enough to the presidency that he should resign. And I guess my own view is that if the Mueller report drops, if there are serious impeachable offenses, if public opinion turns against him, if at that point Trump decides to resign, to oversee a stable transition to a Pence presidency, and then basically conducts himself in a reasonable way, I think that probably on balance the country will be better served if he is pardoned. But I think that if Trump continues to govern in an incompetent, divisive way, I think if he I think if the conclusions of the Mueller report are damning, but Trump doubles down, fights against it, riles up the uglier side of his base, I think if he puts the country through a protracted trial and a legal process, and then after leaving office, if he continues to be a divisive and a difficult force, then I think that probably it would be worthwhile for his successor not to grant him a pardon. And while I think that would, to a certain degree, dampen or undermine the institution of the presidency, I also think it would set an important precedent for future people, for future demagogues, for future people of Trump's ilk to know that even if they can take advantage of a certain historical moment, even if they can get elected, even if they can govern by playing to the worst resentments and spirits of the country, that it isn't inevitable that a pardon is awaiting them on the other side, that there may be consequences in the aftermath. So overall, I would say that the Nixon's overall legacy probably warranted a pardon, but I think with Trump, it's very much an open question. I think it would be both in Trump's interests and the interests of the presidency, and ultimately in the interests of the country, if Trump can learn from the way Nixon handled Watergate and also the aftermath. And I think that if he can learn those lessons, then a pardon of Trump will be justified.